Let's see. And
There's a crackling noise. Is that?
there's a crackling noise. On my
Let's
end.
hope no one else hears it.
Let me close my window and see, just in case that was some sound from outside. Hello everyone, welcome. This is the last of the discussion videos with History Debunked. We'll start in just 1 second. Simon, are you still hearing the crackling or?
A little, but maybe it's not from your window. Don't worry.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what else it could be. I can try on my Skype to turn off sound, but we'll proceed for now. Hopefully, it won't
Oh,
come up in the recording. And if anyone has any problems with the audio, whether that's like hearing Simon or myself or anything like this, then let me know because see the. I'll be able to see the chat as we go on my phone. So if there's any issues, you guys can let me know and I'll amend them as best I can. Cool. So you can hardly hear. Someone can hardly hear you. Okay, that's important. What I'll do, turn you right up, turn me down. How about now, Simon? Say some words.
sorry.
Um,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you, but apparently the audience can't. So would you say some words so that we can? This will be
Yes,
cut out.
I thought we were doing chapter 7 rather than chapter 8. We did chapter 6 last time.
Chapter 7.
Yes, we did chapter 6 for the last one.
Yes, we did. Sorry, no, I mean that was just what I was reading before. Yes, we're reading chapter 7. I've also read chapter 7.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah, that's fine.
Mea maxima culpa. Simon's still low. Okay, hold on. If I turn myself down relatively and then turn Simon up all the way. Still, can you guys still not hear Simon? Because I hear him just fine. Now the sound's okay for both of us. Simon's now it's more equal. Okay, I think I just need to turn myself way down, and then the audio will be equal between the two of us.
Are you working a mixing deck there, Bella?
Yes, this is like OBS Studio. It's good that we're live, so that, and we haven't this before, which will obviously be cut out of the actual thing, so that people can let us know. Because last time we had the same problem apparently, and you were very quiet, so I had to go back and like edit it and like raise your volume so that people could hear you. Um,
Perhaps I should adopt a more butch persona with a booming voice.
yes, I could be like hold on, should I try and use my Alex Jones voice like literal pop only goblins? You can sort of come in and bellow like that. That'll be fun. I should try that. Goodness. Oh, now people can't hear me. For fuck's sake. Right, I'll turn my mic up a bit, and now everyone should be able to hear me just fine. Let us continue. That should be fine. Right. So, critical race theory today. Any like opening thoughts for the chapter?
Yeah, a lot of it is only applicable to America. There's quite a bit there, for example, disenfranchising of former prisoners that don't really apply to this country at all.
To be sure, yeah. Um, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, in the US or the UK, and to be sure, our colonial history and such is what's the word I'm looking for? It's specific, obviously. And when I've seen critical race theory applied in studies in the UK, it's the general ideas that are being applied, like how does the construction of race, for instance, serve the interests of powerful groups in any given time and place, rather than specific things. And some of the policy proposals that they suggested, either in this one or the very last chapter, I took some umbrage with, but it's to be expected. Um, so they're talking about what state of critical race theory is today, because they wrote an earlier version of this book, and this one was written, I think, 2017 or 14. So they're taking into account some things that have happened lately, and I would be very interested in seeing. I would be very interested in seeing what happens with a new version of this book that takes into account the current cultural stuff about critical race theory right now, because you know how it's so much in the news nowadays.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, I mean it's even getting banned in some schools in the US. and we're having, I don't think we have it for critical race theory, but didn't Boris Johnson recently ban the teaching of anti-capitalist sort of ideas in secondary
There was
schools?
something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's we'll talk on it at some point, but I don't like the idea of the government legislating like this is what is morally okay, you know? Of course, law is always going to do that, but it's like I want to avoid it as much as possible. Yeah, right. So they talk about state critical race theory, the right wing offensive, and they say like that conservatives have been launching a well-funded, I should say, attack through media and other such things against critical race theory. And oftentimes these are campaigns against specific issues like bilingual education, affirmative action, employment and educational such, etc. That's still ongoing today. The front burner issues of critical race theory that we have today, they're talking about how minority communities were left behind a bit during the internet boom of the Clinton administration. And I put a note here that yes, they got left behind, but also ethnic, poor white people also were left behind by the tech boom. So yes, they talk about some of the current issues are, I guess, the intersection, as they're talking about here, of race, class, welfare, and poverty. And they talk about some of the issues within critical race theory and the debates about critical race theory, like right now. And one
Yeah,
thing
the
I've
screen has gone completely blank, you know. Oh, that's better. Yeah, it's come back again now.
Okay, maybe it was just a connection issue. One thing I found interesting what they said is when they said critical race theory has yet to develop a comprehensive theory of class. And I could potentially see that. Although they seem very conscious of class efforts, didn't you think, in the previous chapters? So they talk about here how black poverty is different from almost any kind. And, well, in the same way that any kind of poverty is going to be specific to one's demographics, but
No, but this is what I was talking to you about, it being specifically American. We don't know what does real estate steering and redlining mean. I
so
don't think we've got anything comparable, have we here?
I don't think we have, no. So to my knowledge, redlining was a policy of not giving new mortgages to houses within a certain like area on a map, and they draw a red
Yeah,
line
we
around
don't
that
have
map.
that.
Yeah, no. But the reason it's really important in the US is because a district would be redlined if like a single black person lived in that area, which contributed to widening segregation in the US, but then also prevented black families growing into generational wealth by having property in wealthy areas, and led to many housing covenants developing rules that said that they would not sell property to any minority people. So these policies really perpetuated it. But you're right that this stuff has less applicability in the UK, if any, this specific stuff. So they talk also about the critique of standardized testing. And it's interesting that they're mentioning this as part of critical race theory when the issues they're talking about here with regards to standard tests are class bound, because they point out how many questions on these tests, which are supposed in theory to measure your just generic intelligence, they require you to be familiar with things like polo mallets or
It's
regattas.
not true. It's not true at all. That was the case in the 1980s. They're deliberately misleading people here. How much do you know about the Scholastic Aptitude Test?
Not very much, I have to admit.
Okay, they used to have a series of questions on it, analogies. So one of them, and this was a long, long time ago, this is mid-1980s. I don't know why he's pretending that it's still going on. The question was this: runner is to marathon as something is to regatta. Now the answer is, of course, oarsman. But A, you didn't need to. I've never taken part in a regatta. I could have worked out that analogy. B, they don't even have analogy questions now. It's all a straightforward comprehension test, reading a passage and being asked questions about it. I don't know why they're working that in now when they know perfectly well this is all 30 years out of date. This is what edition is it? Is this the 2017 or the
I th
2020 edition?
oh, I think it's 2017. It's almost certainly not 2020. Um, to 2017, yeah, by New
20,
York.
right, okay. It's 30 years out of date, and Delgado knows this perfectly well. They're putting that in there and hoping nobody will notice it.
I mean, yeah, I need to know
It says
whether, like,
many class-bound questions. It's not true.
yeah, this is very much possible. I mean, I would need to look at like actual sort of the standardized tests that are currently being used in the States and or in the US to see, because I'm sure there are other ways in which maybe this specific case is outdated, but I wouldn't be shocked if there were other cases which are much more, which are
Yeah,
still
yeah.
class bound.
You'll get that in any test, whether it's A levels or the 11 plus or anything. Nothing can ever be completely cultured and neutral, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, it's actually a big problem in classics precisely because, like, in Britain at least, upper and middle class people, I don't know, the classics are more of a thing in their families. Like, their families are more likely to read their children books, I think, at least just based on maybe even just stereotypes and people I've known of like Homer or whatever. Whereas that same cannot be true for working class people. So that's of course going to give middle class people a big advantage. Um,
But
so
that's a choice that parents make for themselves. Books, second-hand books are cheap enough. You can get them from charity shops, dirt cheap. If you feel the greatest predictor of a child's success in life is the number of books in the home. It's not to do with the parents' career. It's not to do with income. It's how many books the child grows up with in the home.
is that
And since
actually?
books are cheap enough that anybody can fill their house with them, if you choose not to fill your house with books, choose it instead with expensive consumer durables, then you're going to handicap your child educationally.
Well, so even if that's true, why there are probably going to be factors in their upbringing or their lifestyle which make working class people more likely to make those choices than upper class people. Like it may just never have occurred to to a working class person to fill their child's room with books because that was never part of how they were raised. So I don't think that's something that can be put on them, saying that your child is performing worse in school.
Well, what I'm saying is that Delgado says here the best predictor of a person's SAT score is his or her father's occupation. It's not true. The best prediction of SAT score is not the father's occupation, it's how many books there are in the home. You can't change. Obviously, if you come from a home where the father is a quantity surveyor or an engineer or a surgeon, that's definitely going to give you an advantage. So that would be unfair. But if the main predictor for the SAT score is how many books there are in the home, that's something that everyone can remedy. Second-hand books are cheap; you can fill your home with them.
I suppose, and that's certainly something I would advocate for everyone is to not just like put books in your home, but talk to your child as often as much as possible. I've heard that that can help as well with
Oh, and that's
vocabulary
completely
development.
free.
Um, let's move on to the second issue, which is like environmental justice, which I think is not only very important now, but it's going to be even more important in the future with, oh God, climate change and how we've had the heat wave last week, and it's only going to get worse from here on out. And environmental justice is going to become really, really important. So they talk about how installations like toxic waste sites, radioactive tailings, sewage treatment plants are disproportionately placed in or near minority communities or on Indian reservations. Lead poisoning as well is very much like racially divided in the US, and the lead poisoning epidemic I think is quite tragic in the US really, because of the permanent effect it has on your like brain power and such lot. But yeah, so they say that here that the marketplace is far from neutral and a corporation taking advantage of a community's financial vulnerability by like creating jobs in sewage treatment, say in a poor area, is a bit predatory. There was that issue in Flint, Michigan as well, wasn't there, where companies obviously selling bottled water to residents who don't have drinking water because the government is not doing enough to get it to them or fix their
And I'm
supply.
afraid, yeah, that's the nature of capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Flint water stuff situation just looked so grim in general and took so long as well. Yeah. This is a case study that they give to show the effects of redlining and other such policies later on. So starting in the 1950s and then later on how environmental hazards get spread throughout the US. So they simply say that it's no historical accident that Jersey Heights today is 99% African American because people were prevented from living there, and now it's sort of disproportionately, and now there are more like environmental hazards there than in other areas, and this creates another disadvantage that minority people are more likely to have to deal with, which I think is true. And like, I mean, you're right, Simon, to say that it's a consequence of capitalism, which is partly why I think an integrative class approach is helpful for that as well, because I'm sure that poor white people also have this kind of stuff in their areas. And so uniting on that front might be a good way to try and address those problems. Oh, welfare, here we are. This is a very interesting one. They say some writers believe that the reason why welfare has been cut over the last few decades in the US is that the public sees the recipients of welfare as having black and brown faces, even though more whites receive welfare than do people of color. I found that rather interesting. Yeah, any thoughts on this?
Now, here's a statement which is completely untrue. He says white poverty usually lasts only for a generation or two, and then goes on to say that black or brown poverty is apt to last forever. That's completely false. What happens to poor white families after 2 generations to stop their poverty? I don't get it. And I've certainly seen brown families. I'm thinking now of families that come from India, and after a generation or two, they become upper middle class. Their poverty doesn't last forever at all. It's not true.
Also, like you said earlier, right? A lot of these issues are specific to the US, and so they'll be harder. Sorry, they won't be as applicable in the UK. So it could well be
But
true that.
I'm sorry, I don't get it. What happens to white people in America that stops them being poor after a generation or two? I don't get it.
Well, yeah, that's fine. So
In,
like,
in this country, obviously, I know white people and they've been poor working class people for generations,
mm.
going back to the mid 19th century. I'm wondering what it is in America that suddenly stops white people being poor after 2 generations.
Well, so one of them is owning property and having generations of property within your family in wealthy and prestigious and environmentally clean areas, right? So if you are a black family and you were redlined out of buying a house in the good part of town, even though your great grandparents were doctors and they could have afforded to buy it.
Mhm.
So they settled in a poor area of town, and even if they own the house there, it's worth less, and so they can't move out of that area, and there's less economic
Oh,
opportunity.
yeah, no, no, no. I readily apprehend that. I don't understand why white poverty only lasts for a generation or two.
Also, so
What?
like,
What?
yes,
He said here, white poverty, except perhaps the rural side, usually only lasts for a generation or two. But I mean, what happens after 2 generations to stop poor white people being poor anymore? I don't understand.
well, yeah, a white family who was also able to move into a prestigious housing covenant in an
Yeah, but
all-white area.
some white families don't move into prestigious housing areas, do they? Some are born and grow up in the same area, the same poverty-stricken area of the city, and they live there all their lives as their parents did. What is it that's supposed to stop them being poor after
I
two
believe
generations?
I believe in the US there was federal assistance that was more readily available to white people to get them help in buying a first house. I think I don't remember this perfectly, but I think there was some governmental assistance to help with that for white people that there wasn't for black families, and so that wealth compounds. Also, the issue of if white people, because of racist admission policies in previous generations at universities, were able to send more of their children to prestigious universities because of legacy issues, that their children are more likely to be admitted to those top
Yeah, that's
schools.
a
And
tiny minority. He's making a generalization here, and I don't honestly don't get it. There's plenty of white people that have been poor for generations that their whole lives. If I go back through my family tree, which I did, when my daughter was young, I've got nothing but labourers and paupers and all sorts of things. My family I come from has been poor since the 1780s. It's ridiculous to say that the poverty only lasts for a generation or two for white people, but for black and brown people it lasts forever.
Perhaps I mean, maybe this would betray his class blindness on his part. Perhaps this comes from a perspective where poverty for him is like relative poverty. So, I don't know, getting by as opposed to doing very well. And maybe that is the kind that only lasts for a generation or two. I do agree that it's a generalization that certainly requires a citation immediately so that we can see this kind of stuff. Because I'm sure economists have analyzed this and there's an answer to the question, but they haven't given us a reference for that answer. Although maybe, to be fair, it's in the extended reading list at the bottom of this chapter. There are some other factors though that could cause black or brown poverty to last longer. So, for instance, they talk about over policing and how if you have a father who gets locked up, maybe because of over disproportionate policing in the area or because of the drug war, and the drug war was explicitly designed to penalize black and brown people and also like political opponents of Richard Nixon. His aide admitted to that; it's on tape. So if a father gets locked up for that and can't provide for the family, that generation of the family is going to be impoverished, and that might perpetuate to the next generation, whereas white neighborhoods are less likely to be policed in the same way. So
Yeah, but the thing is, you're talking about Nixon, that's 50 years ago. Yes, things were pretty rough in the 50s and 60s, but times have changed since then. I don't understand either how middle class brown children can fall from grace with breathtaking speed just because they get low grades at school. A few low grades at school. How does that cause them to fall from grace? I don't understand.
I think what this is meant to mean is that it's almost this idea of, have you heard in race theory of the I can't remember the exact term, but it's this idea that was true, especially in the Reconstruction era, but it lasted within Black American society, of having to work twice as hard to get the same amount of recompense for one's
You're talking about
efforts.
Reconstruction after the American Civil War, yeah?
Yeah, but it's an idea that had its genesis then, since
Well, it's
obviously.
longer ago than Nixon, isn't
No,
it?
no, no, I know, but what I'm saying is that I think it's continued to some degree in like Black American culture. This recognition that a black person has to work harder in many instances to be seen as, or to get the same outcome as a white person. I think it's goodness, he's a famous Dave Dave Chappelle, I think, has talked about this. How he's like a really famous celebrity and such, and he's in this nice area, and his neighbor is white, and he's not famous or like super big or anything. He's just like a regular dentist, and that's why he's able to afford to live there. And he talks about how, in terms of like, I guess, Dave Chappelle's a huge celebrity compared to him, which is a bit of an arrogant rant for Dave Chappelle to have made, but it's still something of a point. And so I think what they're saying here is that like a few low grades, they may not be able to get into a good university, and that can have a knock-on effect, so they don't get a good job, and then they stay in poverty. I think maybe they're being dramatic, perhaps, with it, but they have a point within it, I think, personally. And they're talking also about universal programs sometimes end up widening the gap between whites and blacks. And the assertions they talk about here, like containing hidden preferences and assumptions that enable whites to benefit more from them, I need to see specific policies and such. I can't respond to something like this that's just so generic. And so unless we have any more specific points
No,
about
no.
so policing and criminal justice, I feel this is one of those issues where the case is much stronger, so one of the most powerful statistics that they cited, which I think is quite telling, is that black men who murder whites are executed at a rate nearly 10 times that of whites who murder blacks.
Yeah, of course.
It also varies victim. If the if the victim is black, by contrast, the defendant is far less likely to get the death penalty, just in general, regardless of the race of the murderer. they talk also about in the drug war, crack cocaine offences received and still receive harsher penalties than powder cocaine, and crack cocaine is the kind that black people, especially poor people, are apt to use. So that's a rather deliberate thing. And the war on drugs itself initially being instituted to penalize and disenfranchise minorities, it's not surprising that the drugs that poor people use would be more likely to be penalized heavier. And they make a good point, I think, here that white collar crime, like, insider trading, price fixing, it causes a lot more like destruction than street crime, but we penalize that much less or less harshly, I think.
I don't get that at all. So you mean that bribing a businessman will cause as much harm as shooting somebody in the street? How does that work?
Like insider trading.
Harm, how are you measuring harm?
It's a good question. And this is where it gets complicated. But
It
I
says
mean,
here it's more deaths and property loss than all street crime combined. How does bribing a businessman cause deaths?
why I don't know specifically for bribery, but let's say insider trading.
Yeah.
Let's say you have some knowledge, you have a friend in Congress, and he tells you
Mhm.
about some federal housing program that's going to, I don't know, buy up a lot of area in this part of town. And so because you know about that, you buy stock in a different company that would be benefited by this, and then you suddenly get rich, and the company that you're investing in and is getting rich gentrifies an area, and
Yep.
lots of people are sort of priced out of the property that they're in.
Yep.
Yeah. So
How does
that's,
that cause deaths?
well, it might cause, well, death is maybe an exaggeration, but it certainly causes a lower quality of life because those people who are
No, he
priced.
specifically says that things like price fixing and insider trading cause more deaths. How does price fixing cause deaths? Honestly don't understand this.
No, it's fine. And so I think what they're saying is that, for instance, if you imagine LA, and we take the example I was given before of somebody being priced out of a property area,
Yeah.
they might end up homeless on the streets of LA, and there's lots of, unfortunately, death that happens there because there's not enough services to provide for the homeless. So people might die as a result of a long chain of events that started off with somebody doing insider trading or embezzlement or consumer fraud or tax evasion. It's like a matter of all of these things are small elements which ultimately lead to knockdown consequences further down. Like somebody doing some insider trading, it's not like somebody instantly dies straight away. It might be that 10 years later a family is in a much worse financial situation, but as a result of a chain of events which can be linked to the initial insider trading. I
I
agree
wonder
that
what
it's
the history
hyperbolic.
is, because he says on a per capita basis, so presumably he's measured these deaths over 10 years and then averaged them out and looked at the street crime as well.
Yeah, I mean, like I agree that it's a bit confusing. I think property loss and is a much better measure. I'm sure that there has been more property loss on a per capita basis because of white collar crime than blue collar crime. That doesn't surprise me one bit because the amount that a single tax cheat, in the billionaire class gets away with vastly outstretches the amount that people just don't carry enough money on them most of the time for it to be stolen off them in large enough quantities. Um,
Cheating on the taxes doesn't actually result in property loss, or it needn't. For example, if suppose I were earning £100,000 a year from doing something, and I managed not to pay any tax, that's not causing a housing loss, is it?
well, it's a matter of perspective because surely some programs might be cut in light of not the government's budget not having as much as they need to. Not obviously only because of your tax evasion, but somebody else's tax evasion as well. It all contributes together, and so a housing program might not be funded as well, and so somebody might not be able to afford to live in the area they have been, and some people might slip through the cracks of that and end up on the streets, etc.
I think we need to find some real figures for this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just saying I don't, especially given the high figures involved, I wouldn't be shocked if the property loss thing were true. I agree with you though that deaths is very hyperbolic. It's the kind of language that's better for Twitter than an academic book. Yes. They also talk about this. I really disagree with statistical. Wait, oh sorry, no, this isn't the one. There's another one later that I got like annoyed about. But like so, they talk about statistical discrimination, which is this idea of ordinary people avoiding blacks or Latinos because they believe they are more likely than whites to be perpetrators of crime or members of vicious gangs. Now, I don't know. I would need to think more thoroughly about this concept because maybe it is statistically true, and if so, what should people's reaction be to that is a very interesting question. What do you think about this?
An interesting point. I suppose it depends on the area you're going to. There's parts of Hackney where if I encountered a group of young black men, I might sort of, go out of my way to turn down another street because I know that it's a rough area and that there's violence there in a way that I wouldn't if I were in central London, say. So, I mean, we all
Mm.
make guesses like that, don't we? We do it constantly. You must do that when you're out. You're constantly gauging what's happening around you and what's likely to be a risk or what's not, and sort of keeping your eyes open.
Yeah, absolutely. See, that's why when they say this, I feel like they're assuming, or what they're meaning is or avoiding in just all situations, regardless of class context or development context. Because if that's the case, I can understand it. If you're like in a rich area and you see a bunch of black people having a barbecue and you are nervous and you avoid them because of it, then that is obviously a kind of discrimination. That's because it's not necessary to do that. These particular black people aren't statistically more likely to be committing crime against you, and also likewise, it doesn't. It probably doesn't keep you safe if you're going through a poor area, not being aware of your surroundings, and you come up on a bunch of poor white people. You're probably not that much more safe, or any more safe, if they are poor and they might want to mug you.
Yeah.
So yeah, um, they talk here about a rather, I think, sad case, describing the conditions of people living in an area which has a lot of gang activity. It sounds absolutely horrendous. Area residents have had their garages used as urinals, their homes commandeered as escape routes, their walls, fences, garage doors, sidewalks, and even their vehicles turned into a sullen canvas of gang graffiti. The people of this community are prisoners in their own homes, which, yeah, it's very unfortunate.
It sounds like Kingsmead or Pembroke Estate in Hackney. That's not at all unusual. Using people's homes is known as cookering. You're probably familiar with this.
I'm not. Cookering.
Are you not?
No.
Okay, if you some of those gangs, some of the dealers on the estates like Kingsmead in Hackney, if they find someone living alone who's vulnerable, perhaps they've got slight learning difficulties or they look weak, they'll muscle in on the home and pretend to be making friends with the person and then use it as a base for drug dealing. It's called cookering. It's a terrible
Oh
problem.
man, and imagine that must put the person in a bit of legal
Yeah,
jeopardy.
yeah, it's dreadful. But that sort of thing isn't specific to America. That certainly happens in Britain.
Yeah, I suppose people are always, well, in these kinds of contexts, people are going to take advantage of the vulnerable, unfortunately. Um, they talk here about how some race scholars urge jury nullification, which I don't know if you're more familiar with this. Perhaps it's very complicated, from my understanding.
Yes, no, it's not complicated. It used to happen in this country when the bloody code was in force at the end of the 18th century. At one time, there were over 200 laws, which, if they were broken, could technically be hanging offences. And it got to the point where juries wouldn't convict. So picking the pocket to more than 5 shillings was a hanging offence. So a jury would bring in a verdict that the value of the money taken was 4.11 or something to avoid making it a capital charge. And the same thing happens with black juries. Sometimes people like having juries with a lot of working class people because they know they're more likely to be acquitted. Snaresbrook Crown Court, which is in East London, has a much higher acquittal rate than some courts because most of the jurors are working class and ethnic minority.
That's really interesting. Um, wow, that's quite cool. But yeah, that's quite I don't know. I think I do like that a jury has the power on their own to say, as a community, we don't want to accept this standard of law. Um, I can see how people with a lot of I can see how this principle might go against like ideas of universal justice for the nation, but that's a more complicated legal matter that I'm not qualified to discuss. But yeah, that's very interesting. Um, so they talk also about three strikes laws, um, which are horrendous, but thankfully I don't think we have an equivalent here, do we?
No, there used to be a thing called preventative detention in this country, where if somebody was convicted of a minor offence, if they had a long string of offences, they could be given a sentence of 14 years to keep them out of circulation. That's all been abolished now.
That's good. I remember like years ago when I was reading about Scandinavian prisons and Norway in particular. There's a rule in the Norwegian Constitution which some people find problematic. I think it's that it's either a single person cannot be convicted for more than 21 years, either within their lifetime or for a single crime. I can't remember which.
Mm.
And I mean, the US gives out longer sentences than any other nation, in part because there's literally a financial private industry that's lobbying for harsher sentences because they get money when people are locked up, which is horrendous in so many ways. And I was shocked recently to learn that we have private prisons in the UK as well, which, God, it's one of those things that you feel like it feels like obviously shouldn't be privatized. Like, I don't know, the army and the police and firefighters should not be privatized. You would have assumed prisons as well, but apparently not. um, Goodness. But yeah, and so to an American perspective, that Norway's 21 years sounds ridiculous. But then the article said that it was politically motivated. The reasoning was that no matter what, because it's in their constitution, a government can't do what like Nixon did and pass a law that disproportionately targets their political opponents and therefore, get them out of the way. Which is, I think, I quite like that idea in terms of as a safeguard against incursions on freedoms, really. Um, this section is talking about what I just said about longer prison sentences in the US.
Wait, sorry, can you stop for a second?
Yeah,
There. Um, it says here somebody has proposed that the values of hip hop music and culture could serve as a basis for reconstructing the criminal justice system. I don't understand how pop music can reconstruct the criminal justice system. That puzzles me.
I'll be honest, I don't either, and they haven't. I think this is really just one of those references where they're being like, they're giving the name and be like, he's written a book or a dissertation on it. Like, so if you're interested in this idea, you can go and read it. But
Yeah, I think I'd need to do that to find out
yeah,
more about that.
one thing I will say is like often with so many things like this, I don't know, the scholar is being deliberately hyperbolic with their language, and they're being like, through some reconfiguration of the mental processes of the cultural evaluation of hip hop, you can have a reform the criminal justice system. And even if they have a good point, sometimes it's like a very slight effect that would end up happening from the policy that they propose or whatever. So, you don't need to take it too seriously. They talk, they mention the Black Lives Matter movement here, but all they say is that it's been campaigning for change. They haven't, they don't go into too much more detail, unfortunately. And so that we'll go on to hate speech, language rights, and school curricula. They talk about like, sorry, I'm just wondering what did I say? What did I say? Anyway, sorry. Right. So it's essentially hate speech is essentially like speech which is prejudiced against a protected group and therefore receives harsher penalties under present laws for like harassment and such, or extra jail time and such. Um, and I personally don't like the idea of free speech, even though I despise hate speech itself. I think we're in agreement on that, aren't we?
Indeed, so yeah.
Yes. I'll be honest, I don't understand this section too much. I think it's a bit more legal jargonese than I.
Well, this is designed, isn't it, for law students? So it's
Yeah,
not wonder that.
yeah. Um, Yeah. So they talk about safe spaces here, which is interesting. That's a thing we don't hear about too much anymore. And I actually don't think I saw like a safe space in, I think there might be one at University College Dublin where I'm at right now, but it's literally just like a room that you can go with comfy chairs and relax in. It's not that serious. Um, so yeah, we don't, that's not too much of an issue
You
anymore.
probably don't see too many Confederate symbols or flags about, do we?
Thankfully, oh my goodness. Um, no, I mean the Confederate symbol. It's amazing. I don't I can't believe like Americans flying the Confederate flag and being like proud of it and being like, I'm so American with my Confederate flag because that's literally the enemy. It's like it was a country that was formed in opposition to the United States. Like you can't. Okay, so um, it's like actually so there was a really interesting clip. I don't know if you've seen it recently. It was police officers who were attacked during the January 6th riot in the United States, testifying, and one of them said that he couldn't believe that like people with like Blue Lives Matter flags were there, like beating and sometimes killing police officers, and it's like it's an amazing double standard in some of the rioters' heads. Um, but yeah, so they talk about hate speech on the internet causing a problem, and they talk about here how society polarizes with groups not trusting each other and think that the other side is wrong-headed. Now, I think a lot of people who have come to me from watching you certainly still think I'm wrong-headed, but I think that establishing connections with other groups is really important to avoid, I guess, fostering off into individual chunks and not talking to anyone outside of your group. I think it's very valuable. Um, and I thank you as well for like having done this with me because I think it's been a really good opportunity to speak to people who are different to me, and you've given me a lot to think about on lots of issues, you know. So
Oh, I think it's really important to talk like reasonable people about things with, with a disagreement. Because otherwise, it's quite true. People do get polarized into,
mm,
little groups that aren't talking, and that hostility only tends to increase.
yeah, um, one thing. So speaking of actually different groups, one thing that they said here is a second speech-related issue concerns the rights of non-English speakers to use their native language in the workplace, voting booths, schoolhouse, and government offices. And I took objection to this on the basis that, I don't know, if you have 10% Spanish speaking people in a state, sorry, yeah, in a state, why should they have, I mean, it just seems very unfair to demand that most people like either be bilingual or accommodate their language because of literally a minority of people on a linguistic basis. There's a couple like voting booths and like government offices where I think it's beneficial to provide interpreters where it's necessary, and we do that in the UK. But yeah, I thought this was rather unfair, don't you think, to frame that as an
Except, yeah, the only thing is it can lead to trouble. There used to be a thing in the 1980s in Britain called mother tongue teaching. And what happened was that some lessons and whole sections of schools were given over to teaching in Urdu, say, or, everything was done in Urdu. And it wasn't brilliant because the kids tend to speak Urdu at home. And then if they're speaking Urdu at school and Urdu in the mosque, they
mm.
don't actually get to learn English that well. And that creates a problem because then they're automatically excluded and they can't access things that everybody else can.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that's a great idea. We've had issues during the pandemic also, haven't we, with Welsh language education. I've heard of like there being a disadvantage where pupils and it's interesting because they don't come from Welsh speaking households, but the parents want their children to grow up speaking Welsh, so they send them to a Welsh speaking primary school. But then during lockdown, when everything went online, there weren't anywhere near as many resources in the Welsh language on when everything went online. So those children not only were falling behind, but the resources that they did have, when they were suddenly sent home and the parents were given this like Welsh language workbook for their kid, they were like, I have no idea what the hell this says, and they couldn't help their kids. So yeah, there are some issues for sure when we integrate multiple languages into a curriculum like that. I mean, I personally think this is a controversial take, but I think that the foreign language requirement we have is utterly worthless. And I don't think it's a national requirement, but many schools require you to take a GCSE French or German or something. And I think it's entirely worthless. I've never ever met somebody who, having done that, has any useful amount of French or German. You know, it's completely pointless. I would much rather they do like Esperanto, and they can learn some basic ideas of how language works from that. And Esperanto is meant to be so simple that I reckon with like a little, with a GCSE amount, they can probably go on to have a conversation in Esperanto if they needed to. That's just my personal take. And they point out rightly that many countries are happily multilingual, but I think the point of that is that you need policies to accommodate that, if that's the case. And there needs to be some degree of integration, because you brought up Switzerland one time when we were talking, and Switzerland has, I don't know, calling it happy multilingual, it's not a similar kind of context. Like you said, with speaking Urdu, it's not the case that you have French students in an Italian-speaking canton, and they're going to school in French, and they're only going to religious services in French, etc. Like, it's almost like different regions of language within Switzerland. So it's a bit of a different comparison, I think. So yeah, like I said, there is a difference. They say here there's a difference between encouraging the use of English and repressing the use of other languages, but I think we both agree on that anyway. So they talk also, oh yes, about the like anti-immigrant fervent, and it seems like in the US that local police have been given just like really excessive powers to search people and such in relation to suspicion that they might be undocumented, even though the vast majority of undocumented people come to the US and just overstay a visa rather than coming in straight across the border, from my understanding at least. Yeah, any thoughts on these issues?
No, because again, this is an American thing.
Yeah, to be sure. We don't have people crossing the border. Hadrian's Wall is not a massive controversy anymore. Although my old martial arts teacher was a very proud Welsh nationalist, and he always used to bang on at me that there were defences on both sides of Hadrian's Wall. You know, the Celts wanted to keep out the Romans as well, don't you know? I'm like, okay, calm down. Anyway, they talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, very famous case, but I'm sure we're both already familiar with the implications of that. But it was basically the case that established in
1896.
Thank you, 1896, the precedent that as long as a separate but equal accommodation was made for non-white people, you could have racially segregated areas, basically. And they talk about how that wouldn't be undone until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. And they go on to talk about how, like, integration policies, like active efforts by governments but also private institutions to desegregate or to encourage a greater proportion of minority students to attend, such as admissions quotas. They talk about how these affirmative action efforts have been challenged, and some of the lawsuits that are presently going on. And if I understand correctly, a lot of the lawsuits going on in the US are currently being fronted by Asian American people who feel like they are being unduly shut out of admissions. I think there was a case in the US of this like Indian dude who thought that he would, and it may well be true, that he was rejected because he was Asian American, and so he like shaved his head and like changed his name to a black sounding name and pretended to be black.
Yeah, I know that case. Yeah,
his face just looked so funny as well when he did it. Sorry, I know it's a serious matter, but that is a very funny case. But yeah, they say here that if universities were careful to observe the limitations, they could consider race as one factor among many others to achieve a diverse intellectual environment, which I think is true. I think when people say affirmative action, they view it as like, because of an affirmative action policy, if we need to increase the number of minority people at the school, they just go like, right, they take, I don't know, the first 10 black people who apply, and they're like, you get in, come on. But it's like, I don't think it's quite like that. It seems to be like, they take multiple factors into consideration, and if it's a case where you have two candidates who are equally qualified, you might make a deliberate choice to choose one from the minority background in that case, because you want to improve diversity at the school, which I don't think is especially if it's like in terms of merit is even or very, very comparable. I don't think it's unreasonable to make that as a conscious
That's
effort.
not how it works. At Yale and Harvard, they do it deliberately to keep Chinese people out. Every
Mm.
time you have a policy that increases fairness to one person, it automatically increases unfairness to somebody else.
Um, Maybe. I with something like university admissions, I can understand that because it's really finite. Like there are only a certain number of Harvard places each year. So I can see what you mean there. Um, they talk here about the conservative opposition to critical race theory and the ideas therein. So they've argued that affirmative action balkanizes the country, stigmatizes minorities, violates the merit principle, and constitutes a kind of reverse discrimination. And they also say that some, such as the authors of the bell curve, have even argued that minorities may be biologically inferior to whites. And that
You've read the
explains.
bell curve,
I
presumably.
have not. I have seen a very good discussion of its contents by the YouTuber called Sean. It's quite good, but I haven't personally read the bell curve. Have you?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I probably should read it at some point to get it from the horse's mouth. I don't like just hearing a rebuttal, but from what I've heard, it's not very well liked in the scientific community. Um,
It's not very much liked by sociologists. That's rather a different thing. And of course, it says progressive scientists. That means right thinking scientists with the correct views.
yes, although to mine, I think like most scientists are also relatively progressive on the simple basis that education tends to make one more like politically left wing. So like whether that's often measured in the US by voting Democrat versus Republican. Um, so I'd imagine most scientists are progressive just on that basis alone. But yeah, um,
You see, they talk about neo-eugenicist. I don't understand this. You know what eugenics is,
yeah, of
presumably.
course, yeah.
It's breeding humans to be better, but there's nothing like that in the bell curve. I'm puzzled by that.
Correct me if
Challenge the premises of the bell. They didn't really challenge the premises of the bell curve. What they did, they went through the references and found people like Arthur Jensen and Richard Lynn. They quoted people, some of the references for things like Mankind Quarterly, which is edited by Richard Lynn. That was the main criticism of it.
right. Okay. I would personally like look into it more, but the criticisms of the science of it that I got from having watched critiques of it are that the IQ tests that they use to support it often come, for instance, from South Africa, where like there's very heavy discrimination against at the time when there was very heavy discrimination against blacks, which would bias the results. There's also some issues of language biases affecting the tests that were given at the time, and some other factors.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. There's mention of cultural bias. A lot of that IQ stuff was Richard Lynn. A lot of it had been published
Mm.
in Mankind Quarterly, and that's quite true. In South Africa, those findings are not particularly reliable.
And actually, one of the points that came up when I did that, we looked at the idea of merit and IQ in anthropology at university was this idea that merit is situational. And I think this is maybe like a made up story, but it's an illustrative story anyway. It apparently goes that they gave IQ tests to an Aboriginal participant, and he tried to go to his elders and ask them for help in answering it. And the test takers told him that you can't do that. And he said, but this is a test of intelligence, isn't it? This is what sort of intelligent people do. And it shows how the idea of the story is meant to be that for the Aboriginal idea, like intelligence is a person knowing how best to make use of the society that they have around them, whereas we have a very like individualistic idea of merit is like your own brain power. So they talk about how merit is highly situational, um, and they talk about that.
Yeah, they also mention things like the Scholastic Achievement Test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, are coachable, and that's perfectly true. When you went to Oxford, did you have to do the TSA, the Thinking Skills Assessment?
I don't think so.
Did you do any admission tests?
Admission test? No, for my
Yeah.
subject, no.
Okay, no, because a lot of things, for example, law, medicine, PPE, and so on, in addition to the A levels, you have to take tests.
Mm.
So there's the LNAT, the medicine one, and the thinking skills assessment for PPE. They're the deciding ones. They expect a full score of A level. Maybe, what did you do at Oxford?
Archaeology and anthropology.
Oh, right, no, no, I can see it wouldn't
No,
be.
but my brother is doing mathematics now, and he had to do like one of those competence
Yeah,
tests. Yeah,
yeah. They can be coached. You know,
yeah.
you can go online, you can find the past copies of the things, and you can do them. The mark scheme will be there as well. And
Mm.
if you practice, it gives you an edge. So
Not
yeah, that's perfectly true.
not just that, but like I mean, for every subject at Oxford, you have to interview to get in, and I apparently got in specific. Well, everyone gets in specifically because of the interview, but like basically they asked a trick question in my interview. Funny enough, it was about racism. I mentioned on my application that I had read the book Collapse by Jared Diamond, and I really liked it. And that book has been criticized as being racist and neo-colonialist. And they asked me that, like, what do you think about that? And apparently, I hadn't done the due diligence that most people have done. Like the people who get coached for Oxford entrances because they go to like Eton or whatever, they will have learned like the basic academic responses to it, and they would have learned that, and then they would have been told to repeat those because that's meant to
Yeah,
look good. But I didn't do that. I said, I haven't heard of these. What are they? And they explained to me the critiques. And I was like, no, that's bullshit. He's got a whole chapter saying how that's not true. And at that moment, they decided to give me the place. So
yeah, yeah.
my argumentative nature served me well. But the point is that you can be coached for that at Oxford. I've been hired to teach people how to get into Oxford through interviews. So, like, you know, it's situational and yeah, it's not. So we need to be. It doesn't mean that all merit ideas should be thrown out the window, but we just need to be conscious of it when we discuss these kinds of things. Um, they discuss this stuff here, which is quite interesting, about the idea that like affirmative action programs are setting minority students up to fail. So like they'll get people into place and then they'll just fail at a higher rate. Um, I'm ambivalent on this matter. Do you have any like strong feelings about this?
It's a bit of a problem when you push people to get into a really, really competitive place and they can't cope. You get it sometimes. There's some selective schools. There's one in North London called Latimer, and it's got an examination, you know, like an 11 plus, and people get their kids to be coached to get in there. But of course, once they're in there, they can't cope, and it's the same at some of the more, shall we say, academic universities. You can push kids to get in, but when they get in there, you are setting them up to fail.
This is true. I mean, sometimes I wonder if one simply requires, because I believe you're right, that you kind of probably are setting a lot of people up to fail by doing that, but maybe that's not an intrinsic thing and you can provide more resources. And honestly, these resources are probably mostly a matter of class, especially in the UK. I imagine they'd be mostly to do with class for both white and minority students in the UK. So whether that's providing, I don't know, extra resources to help with academic writing style, which I know is a big issue. My university, University College Dublin, fortunately has a free place where people can go and get helps with their writing style and such like that. So um, yeah, I feel like if you're going to have a policy like that of positive discrimination, you need to factor in that you're going to put some people in out of their depths. Um, so they're talking more here about admissions, but we've already talked about that a fair bit. So let's go on to globalization and immigration, which is quite relevant for the present day. They talk about how a globalizing economy removes manufacturing jobs from inner cities and often sends them to other countries. It creates technology and information industry jobs for which many minorities have little training, and it concentrates capital in the pockets of an elite class which seems little inclined to share it. A global economy often includes free trade agreement like NAFTA. So that's just like outlining what happens in a global economy. Um, I put a note here that some Marxist scholars argue that this sort of creates like a global south, which works like the proletariat in classic Marxist theory, a lot of people say that the classical Marxist model of a bourgeoisie and proletariat doesn't fit well in the present day, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But people argue that, India and such as and China have become the factories that are making the stuff that we in the West are consuming, and they are, as nations, almost are the proletariat, which is an interesting perspective to be aware of, I think. They talk here about how in all of these situations where, like, you have sweatshops, whether over abroad or in the US, which take advantage of racially oppressed workers, and they talk about how some people argue with like a decontextualized free market ideology that this is almost like the best that people can get. And I think this is not true, for one, but I think it's often also presented as like, because the market is doing it, it's like natural and almost inevitable, which I don't like as an argument, because I think we have a lot more control over markets than, not maybe not over markets, but we don't have to let markets control us, I should say. And they talk about that here, about how like capitalists can use the threat of industrial operations locating overseas. That's not something that has to be allowed. One could say penalize a company for doing so with taxes in the country and such like that. So I don't like framing it as like inevitable, is all I'm saying. They also talk about immigration law, which of course is very specific to the US, like policing the southern border with Mexico. I put a note here because I do have to say, like, I've been absolutely disgusted by some of the things I've seen during the Trump administration of oh god, you'll have seen the videos, I'm sure, of like when people are crossing through the desert to get to the US. It's very dangerous conditions and many people die. So humanitarian groups and literally churches like will go and leave water in certain places so people find the water and they drink it and don't die, and border guards just going through and throwing away the water to destroy it, and people are being found dead in the desert because of this. It's just evil. Like, god, sorry, it annoys me, basically. I don't know how you're doing that and filming yourself and being proud of it and not think that you're a terrible person. God. Anyway. They talk here about how immigration control board in the US has like vastly disproportionate power compared to regular police, and they can do all sorts of searches and such, which regular police would not be able to do, which I feel is an infringement not only of the immigrants themselves, but also natives' freedoms, frankly. And they ask the important question of who benefits cui bono from increased immigration enforcement and also prison building, because there's a huge private industry, as we talked about. They talk about voting rights. Let's go on to voting rights. Oh, and this is
none of that applies at all to this country.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, thank God, right? But this one, just quickly, it annoyed me. They talk about, okay, communities of color suffer another kind simply by reason of their numerical minority status. I'm like, yes, like, that's literally what a numerical minority is. What the fuck are you supposed to do? But okay, because they talk about it below, right? So they talk about how like cumulative voting proposed by a leading critical race theorist would circumvent one of these problems by allowing voters facing a slate of 10 candidates, for example, to place all 10 of their votes on one. So if one of the candidates is, say, African American, whose record and positions are attractive to that community, the African American candidate should be able to win. And I'm like, but wait, okay, right. So presumably placing all of their 10 votes on one. So like, but then if that happens, and if white people also have 10 votes, they would also place the 10 votes, presumably. Because if whoever's elected in this is like first past the post, then you wouldn't split your vote. It's not like a second choice voting thing. You would put all of the ones on your one that you want to win. So it's entirely pointless, unless they're proposing the white people should have fewer votes in their system, which would be horrible. Sorry, that bit annoyed me. Especially the numerical minority states. Like, come on, dude. But yeah. But they do have a good point about voter ID laws in the US, because from what I understand, voting ID is like a completely overblown scandal. There's like a handful of cases every year of like, it's like 3 a year or more. Sorry, or fewer of people committing voter fraud. And because of that, people are saying that we need to put in laws that require photo ID in order to vote and stuff like this, even though minority communities are much less likely to have these kinds of ID on their person.
Yeah, but that's happening in this country.
Wait,
That law will be starting next year.
it is? Oh, goodness. That's
Oh yeah, yes, you'll need photo identification to vote.
great. Great. See, that's interesting
And that
for me.
again, that's to tackle a non-existent problem of
Mm.
fraudulent voting. It's a very small difficulty. But yeah, the government's brought that in.
I find it, I know, I always find it really annoying when when the original reason to implement a law is almost nothing. That's very annoying when you
Mm.
actually look into it. I mean, it's interesting for me because my only photo ID that I have is a passport photo I took years ago, and I don't look anything like that anymore. So I'd be very interested showing up and like, yo. But yeah, so they talk about identity here, and identity is one of those ones where I find it fascinating, but frankly they're right here to say that fine-tooth matters of identity, like who, how is race classified? How do our concepts of race change across time? They're right that not just do they not affect most people, I don't think most people think about them that much, if we're being completely honest. Most people, like you say, are more concerned with housing and schooling for their kids and such like this. They talk about Latinos and how they sort of have both an indigenous heritage and a European one. Many Latinos consider themselves white, for instance. So that's a matter. Can we only speak of oppressions? We talked about that earlier, about how like oppression is not all the same. It's people's experiences are all very unique. And so we've covered this off already. So let's go on to, I think this is the very last one, on critical empirical analysis, which I'll be honest, I didn't understand this section too well. Did you?
No, not really.
No. I feel like it's meant to be like doing psychological studies and experiments to provide empirical data in support of the claims of critical race theory that like these tests are disproportionately biased against minorities. That's the closest I can get to a gist on this. They quote here from a law case, and they mention the judge talking about Professor Steele, and who presumably has argued that a stereotype threat explains any part of the gap between Caucasian and underrepresented minority LSAT scores. They say Professor Steele does not quantify the effective stereotype threat, nor, at least according to this report, has he performed any research on the LSAT. If there is evidence showing the stereotype threat accounts for some of the LSAT gap, it was not produced in this case. And I think, honestly, if Professor Steele hasn't produced the evidence, then his claim shouldn't be taken seriously. I like some aspects of critical race theory, but I don't think it should be accepted without evidence, honestly. Oh, they talk about the implicit association test. Have you taken this out of curiosity?
I'm familiar with that.
Oh, goodness, I think I took it ages ago. And I think I'm interested to take it again. See, like, not my actual attitudes, but I wonder if my opinions on what it means have changed. I don't know. I feel like those kinds of tests are often, they're fuel for like white liberals to do a lot of hand wringing rather than much else, you know?
Mm.
I don't know, it's like this masturbatory kind of guilt rather than much else. I don't know, I'm not a fan. They talk about, these are like the standards for admitting expert testimony, which are more for lawyers, I think, than for us. One point they said here is that some people in social dominance theory have tried to understand why humans seem to exhibit a drive to control and dominate their fellow citizens, which I don't like this at all. I think this is just one of those things that it's a particularity of our present societies. And we like to think that we are like natural and correct. So we try to come up with an explanation for why it's in our DNA. It's like evolutionary psychology, which I cannot stand. It's the most BS thing I've ever seen. And I think that with that, we come to the end. Like we said, this is the conclusion chapter, and it's almost entirely predictions for the future.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you have anything particular in here that you wanted to talk about in particular?
No, anybody can make predictions like that. It's not, that's simply their own ideas.
Yeah. I mean, my personal motto is potential is a euphemism for nothing. I have no interest in what they think the future of critical race theory might be. And with that being said, I'm showing the chat. I don't know if it's going to be big enough for you to be able to read it. Maybe if I make it a pop-out chat, that will do it. Yeah, here we go. But so we're live. People are watching right now, and they've been posting questions in a chat this whole time. And so, guys, I thought this is why I thought to do it live, because this is the final version. For those of you who've been watching as Simon and I discussed these weeks, do you have any final questions about critical race theory or things we discussed that you would like either of us to answer? Feel free to write some questions in the chat, and I will try to answer them. It looks like you guys have been having some interesting discussions here in the meantime. It's very interesting. Looks like some of you are arguing back and forth. Goodness. We'll just wait a minute and see if any questions come in. And if not, we can answer in the comments. Any questions for Simon?
Alas, I will have to go, I'm afraid, Bella,
It's okay.
because my time is run out.
That's entirely valid. I will see you later. I'll send you. We'll have a talk and catch up more later. How are you doing? Thank you again, Simon, so much for doing this week by week. It's been great talking with you. I've really enjoyed it.
I've really enjoyed it as well, Bella.
Yes. All right. Pleasure. You have an amazing day, Simon.
You too. You take care of yourself
Bye.
now. Cheerio. Bye.
All right, guys. It's just you and me. Just me and the chat. So I can now see the thing. All right, so somebody's asked, what is critical race theory? So Kieran, critical race theory is like a legal framework which seeks to analyze how racial inequalities affect how people are treated by the law, and the ideas that have been developed by critical race legal scholars are being applied elsewhere. They're being applied in other fields such as literature and history, which is mine and Simon's field. Simon's off. Utanam, I literally studied evolutionary biology and psychology at university. I did a degree in anthropology. Like, it's just because here's the thing, guys. When I got to university and we started learning about human evolution, one of the first things we learned is that there is a debate about what the environment was. Because when you've heard evolutionary psychology argument, you'll have heard it phrases back in caveman days, things were X, Y, Z way, and that's why we had to develop a certain mentality. But we don't know what the environment was like. We don't know if we were in caves or an open savanna, all of these things. How about an OnlyFans? Oh my god, I could vent about fucking OnlyFans. Superlative. I'll do a hot tub stream, sarcastically. Any last questions about critical race theory? What does it mean to say race is a social construct when there is no coherent societal agreement about what race is? Thank you, Simon. That's really a good question. So what does it mean to say race is a social construct? So a social construct doesn't mean that a thing is not real or is not important. A social construct is just an idea which affects and organizes our social world, which requires everyone to participate in it in order to continue its effects. So money, for instance, I'm holding up a coin here. Money is a social construct. This actual metal coin is not equivalent to the apple that I might be able to exchange it for at a store. But because we collaborate in believing in the social construct of money, it functions in our society as equivalent to this apple. And that's an example of a social construct at work. Now, to say that race is a social construct is to say that race, the concept of race is something that we all collaborate in believing is true, and it structures our society accordingly. So like, you can apply for certain programs at university and school if you're from a minority background, because we are collaborating in the social idea of race. Now, when critical race theorists say that the social construction of race is not supported by biology, what they mean to say is that the biological realities of race, the biological categories of race, don't actually match up with the social categories. So here in the UK, we have very broad categories like Afro-Caribbean, South Asian, blah, blah, blah. But actually, in terms of genetics and ancestry, but also with other biological things like which diseases one is susceptible to, people of racial biology is actually quite complicated and it doesn't match up to the categories. A person with South Asian who is identified as South Asian may have very different genetics from another person who is identified as South Asian. It's a very complicated matter. I have a friend, for instance, who was half black and half Indian, but because of the way we perceive blackness, people only ever saw her as black. And so they talked about her as a black woman, even though her genetics and therefore her like medical vulnerabilities would also be South Asian, right? So she would have a higher propensity for diabetes, for instance. So where are we? That was a good question, though, by the way. Lewis Dawn has asked, do I think that white spaces are as important as other ethnic group spaces in Britain? Lewis, that's an interesting question. I sort of think no, because the point of these kinds of spaces is that they're formed out of a specific political need, and so in an racially equal society, we probably wouldn't need to have ethnically secluded spaces either, and I wouldn't like them to be. But yeah, English said all psychology is evo-psych. There's no other kind of definition. There is not. There is Freudian psychology, there's cognitive behavioral psychology, there's all kinds of different kinds of society other than evolutionary. Bella, what is your conclusion over CRT? Do I think it creates more or less division in society? So I think, like, at the end of the day, guys, as you'll have seen in the videos, critical race theory is a collection of academic ideas and frameworks. It can be, it's not a single monolith. Some people within critical race theory disagree with other critical race theorists. It's a really complicated field, and I just don't think there are some ideas that are valuable, and we shouldn't dismiss critical race theory out of hand. Like some states in America right now are trying to ban critical race theory, and I don't think that's a productive thing because there are some ideas that are worth listening to. I think Siren has given me some ideas that are worth listening to and that I've taken in on board when I've been studying. Somebody asked me, am I looking forward to the Civil War? Goodness, I don't think there's going to be a Civil War. I'd be useless. Am I wearing? No, I'm wearing leggings. And also, yeah, like that's not relevant to critical race theory. Why do I think that police officers were killed on June 6th? Oh, dude, the June 6th thing. People are fucking crazy in that June 6th thing. People, wait, Peace Hunter, there was a police officer who was killed, in the 6th riots. Doesn't CRT completely ignore that disparities are the norm and not the exception, and that equity is impossible to obtain? Well, how do we know that equity is possible to obtain? And even if disparities are statistically normal, why do we accept it as normal? Provide more resources is a typical lefty response that has not ever produced results. Stella, I don't think that's always true. From my understanding, the gap in educational attainment between minority ethnic students in the UK and white majority students in the UK has been narrowing over the years because there have been efforts to address their needs specifically with programs in schooling. So, Peace Hunter, you can't just keep insisting that no cops were killed on January 6th. We have one of them on video, man. We have video of him being crushed. We know that he's dead. Like, don't be crazy. Sorry, I shouldn't like evoke mental illness in that way, but we have good evidence for it, man. Yeah, but Michael, he died after being crushed indoors, man. It's really vicious. Oh goodness. Okay, look, I need to look into it then. But I think from the interviews I saw him get in the video, it seems very likely that that his death might be linked to the suffering that he experienced there. Some MH said, because humans are not clones, if you want to eliminate disparity, it can only be done by oppression. Yeah. Wait, can it be done by oppression? I don't know if that's true. Terminus S starts, have I spent a day excavating? I have spent 5 weeks excavating because I had to complete my degree. Oh God, guys, it's the worst. Like, if you've been thinking about doing excavation, because people can, right? You can, there's loads of groups. If you want to do archaeological excavation and you don't have a degree in it, the Sedgefield Historical Archaeological Research Project are really good. Sedgefield Historical Archaeological Research Project. They're called Democratic Archaeology, and they'll give you all the training you need, and you can go in and you can start excavating straight away. It's really good fun. They do some great work in Britain. I did 3 weeks with them excavating an Anglo-Saxon site. I did 2 weeks in Oxford excavating a Roman site, and I think I did another 2 weeks in Scotland excavating a 7th century house. But guys, in my experience of it, excavation is awful. You're camping, right, most of the time, so you're cold and sweaty and awful. Sometimes it's really hard physical labor. Other times it's the most dreadfully boring task, and you have to pay just enough attention that you can't let your mind wander and think about things or be meditative. But the task itself is so boring. You're just scraping away layers of soil waiting for like one tiny artifact. And when you find that one artifact, it's shit. So yes, I've done excavation. I don't recommend it, basically. Um, Biological and cultural differences. Oh, last question. I would like to hear your opinion. Why do I think CRT is not applied to any non-white country? Lewis, you know that it's not, right? Like in India, for instance, and in China, there are racial minorities, and scholars and academics there have arguments and debates and models of how to deal with it. I think we just don't hear about this as much because we're not Indian and we're not Chinese. We don't speak the language these papers are written in. We don't hear about these debates. But I happen to know I have a very close friend who is from a Chinese, like essentially indigenous Chinese minority who is not Han, and she partly got into university because of essentially an affirmative action program within China, because they acknowledged that her family is at an economic disadvantage, so they gave her extra ability to get into education. So Lewis, there is critical race theory in other countries as well. It's an important thing in non-white majority countries. Um, all humans. Wow, people are getting mad. Terminus, you've worked for 15 years in archaeology. That's really cool. Nice. I should say I like have a massive respect for you, Terminus. I feel like doing 15 years working in archaeology, because it's important work. Obviously, like learning about the past is so important, and I love it as well. Is it true that older Egyptian buildings are superior to newer as if the quality declined over time? Peace Hunter, like I did a bit of about Egypt in my degree, but it was a long time ago and I'm not a specialist in it, so I can't answer, I'm afraid. But Peace Hunter, if you want an answer, one thing you might want to do is go over to a YouTuber called Armchair Egyptologist. He's really good, and if you leave a comment or join his Discord server, he'd probably be willing to give an answer to that would be more qualified than what I can give. Yeah, it teaches you about physical reality. I mean, to be sure, Term, there's some benefits of like learning archaeology. Yes, Atch, there are like affirmative action sort of policies and such within China. These are things that are true. Am I into pleather? I don't know what the hell pleather is. Right. Any last questions about CRT or anything else? Or I suppose, with that being the case, I will go. Oh, I'll relax. A couple of other things. Yep, I will. I have a Discord server. You? I have a Discord server. You guys should come and join my Discord server. It's really cool. We share memes. We have fun. I'm going to invite you guys. And also thank you guys for coming from Simon's channel and for listening and watching. And I've had a great time discussing with Simon. So you can come and join my Discord server. We have discussions. We watch movies together sometimes. We chill out while we study. It's a great time. What I'm trying to do, I'm actually trying to set up a series very similar to this, not with Simon, but a different YouTuber, discussing gender hurts with a radical feminist. I'm trying to set that up. And if anyone's seeing this perhaps and knows a radical feminist or a gender critical YouTuber who would agree with this book and would like to discuss it live with me in a similar format to Simon, do let me know and I will get in touch with them, or let them know about me and we can come and we can discuss that. So yeah, anyway, thank you guys so much for coming once again. Oh, one last thing. join the Discord server. Tomorrow I am going to be teaching Beowulf, and all that fun stuff. So if you love Western heritage and English culture and English history, feel free to come along, and we're going to be discussing the second chapter of Beowulf. We're going to be discussing Beowulf every week, I should say, on Thursdays at noon. So that's going to be fun. Look forward to seeing some of you guys there. And everyone else, thank you so much. I hope you guys have an amazing day and an amazing week. Bye, everyone. Oh my.